Imagine the silence of the desert. Only the wind rustles across the sands, blowing around the stone giants that have stood for thousands of years. The pyramids. Their shape is unmistakable, but their secrets are not. But who really built them? What did the priests hide deep within the pyramids? And why did they need so much gold, so many mummies, and so many secrets? Before we dive into the heart of these mysteries, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. It helps promote historical content and inspires us to make new discoveries. When we hear the word priest, we picture people in white robes standing before an altar, praying to the gods. But in ancient Egypt, priests were not just religious figures. They were the keepers of the most important resource, knowledge. The priests of ancient Egypt didn't just believe in the gods. They managed temples, the economy, medicine, and even death. They knew when the Nile would flood. They decided who could be buried with honors and who would be left to the mercy of the sands. And they knew the real reason why the pyramids were built. Temples as centers of power. Egyptian temples were not just religious buildings. They were real centers of administration. Archives were kept there, tax scrolls were stored, time was calculated, and even architectural blueprints were developed. And at the head of it all stood the priest. The high priest in the temple had almost as much power as the pharaoh. In some regions, he controlled not only spiritual life, but real life as well. He made decisions about building canals, monitored the harvests, and gave advice to the ruler himself. Knowledge is power. The priests knew how to read the stars, how to cure diseases, and how to mummify bodies so they wouldn't decompose for thousands of years. But most of all, they knew how to keep this knowledge hidden from outsiders. Texts were written on papyrus, encrypted with symbols, and hidden in secret chambers inside temples and pyramids. Ordinary people were not allowed to know what was inside. Even many pharaohs didn't have full access to this knowledge. Why so much secrecy? Because the priests believed that knowledge is power, and power doesn't belong to everyone. The priests rarely left behind direct instructions or confessions. Almost everything we know about them comes from indirect traces, symbols, hints, structures. This isn't religion in the usual sense. It's a system of power wrapped in myth. The priests were engineers and astronomers long before anyone else. Before the invention of telescopes and modern calendars, Egyptian priests were already observing the celestial bodies. They noticed that the flooding of the Nile coincided with the appearance of Sirius in the morning sky. This allowed them to accurately predict the times for planting and harvesting crops, which became a source of their influence. But the priests didn't just observe the stars. They used this knowledge in construction. Many temples and pyramids are precisely aligned with the cardinal directions or with specific celestial events. This is not a coincidence. It is a mathematical and symbolic calculation. For example, on certain days of the year, the temple at Karnak is completely illuminated by the rays of the rising sun. This creates the illusion of a divine appearance. For an ancient Egyptian, this was a miracle. For the priest, it was a carefully calculated effect. Why pyramids? And why this particular shape? A pyramid is not just a tomb. It is an engineering, astronomical, and symbolic structure. It has a perfect shape, stable, geometrically complete, rising from the earth to the sky. It symbolized the ascent of the soul. But that's not all. There is an opinion that beneath every pyramid lies a hidden structure, tunnels, chambers, and vaults. Some of them remain unopened to this day. The priests placed not only the bodies of pharaohs in the pyramids, but also knowledge that was not meant to fall into the wrong hands. There is a theory that some tombs were never intended for burials at all. They didn't find a telephone there, but they did find halls where sounds echo in a unique way, where the geometry disrupts familiar sensations. These were possibly places of initiation or the transfer of knowledge in absolute secrecy. Mummification as a secret ritual. Mummification is another area that was completely controlled by the priests. Only they knew all the stages. Only they had access to the necessary substances. And they strictly followed the ritual. Why? Because mummification was not just a way to preserve the body. It was a way to prepare the soul. It was believed that if everything was done correctly, the soul would continue its journey into eternity. But if it was done incorrectly, the soul could get stuck between worlds. That's why even the slightest mistake could be fatal. This made the priests indispensable. Without them, there was no afterlife, which meant you couldn't truly die without them. The priestly hierarchy. Who was at the top? The system was well defined. Each temple had a chief priest. The first-rank priest. Beneath him were dozens and even hundreds of juniors. Some were in charge of rituals, some of the libraries, and others of the ritual kitchen. There were even priests whose sole job was to clean the sacred vessels. But only the most initiated had access to the secret knowledge. They were trained from childhood, and not everyone made it to the highest level. At the top of the priestly hierarchy were people whom even the pharaohs could not ignore. Sometimes they became the gray eminences of Egypt, and sometimes they were open rulers. Thousands of years ago, at the edge of the desert, giants rose up. The pyramids, silent witnesses of eras that have survived wars, time, and history itself. Tourists are amazed by their size. Scientists argue about the methods of construction, while conspiracy theorists look for extraterrestrial traces. But the truth, as always, lies deeper. The Egyptians themselves called the pyramids Mer, which can be translated as the place of ascension. But ascension of whom? The soul of the priest or information? Why a pyramid specifically? At first glance, the shape of a pyramid is simple, but the higher you look, the more complicated it becomes. The pyramid is stable. It can't be toppled over. Its base is a wide square, and its peak is a point reaching toward the sky. This isn't just architecture, it's a symbol. The earth as the foundation, the peak the heavens. Between them lies a path that the priests knew and guarded. But in ancient Egypt, nothing was done without reason. Everything had a hidden meaning, even the placement of the pyramids. The geometry and the stars, the pyramids on the Giza Plateau are aligned precisely with the cardinal directions. Their orientation is so precise that even modern technology couldn't surpass this accuracy without special instruments. How did the Egyptians achieve this? The priests used their knowledge of the movement of the stars, especially by aligning with Sirius and Orion. Orion is the symbol of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Sirius is the star of Isis. Together, these two figures create the myth of resurrection and eternal life. And if you look from above, the arrangement of the three main pyramids resembles the three stars of Orion's belt. Coincidence? The priests believed that the arrangement on Earth should reflect the sky, as above, so below. It's not just decoration. It's a principle by which the entire civilization lived. What's inside? The pyramids were never just tombs. Inside, there's a complex system of chambers, corridors, ventilation shafts, and hidden passages. Most of the pyramids were looted back in ancient times. But even in the empty, abandoned halls, traces of strange knowledge remain. For example, in the Great Pyramid of Khufu, there are no decorations, no hieroglyphs, no scenes from the Book of the Dead. Everything is strict and geometric. Why? Some scholars believe that this pyramid is less of a tomb and more of a machine for rituals, possibly even for altering consciousness or states of mind. Sound behaves strangely inside the pyramid. In some places, it gets amplified, while in others it disappears. There are chambers where you can only hear your own breathing. This creates a sense of mystique, almost a trance. Perhaps this is where priestly initiation rituals took place. A novice would be plunged into darkness, isolation, and absolute silence to erase their past and rewrite their consciousness. Only after that would they gain access to secret knowledge. Unknown chambers. New cavities are still being discovered in the pyramids to this day. In 2017, a void was found above the Great Gallery of the Khufu Pyramid using scanning technology. Scientists don't know what it is, a secret room, an archive, or just a construction error. But in Egypt, nothing was ever done without a reason. The priests might have left this cavity as a repository of knowledge or as a symbolic space. Or maybe it's a place that's still waiting to be discovered. The function of the pyramids, more than just a tomb. For most people, a pyramid is a tomb. But archaeologists are increasingly asking, if it's just a burial place, why is everything so complicated? Why are there so many chambers, empty spaces, shafts, and tunnels? Why was the pyramid built with such mathematical precision, as if it were calculated by cosmic standards? One hypothesis is that this was a place of initiation, a process that a priest, a warrior, or even the pharaoh himself would go through to become something greater. Something like a trial, to descend into the depths, to find yourself in complete darkness, to be left alone with yourself and emerge a different person, perhaps a new bearer of ancient knowledge. There's even a theory that the pyramids were used as resonators. Some researchers claim that the architecture of the inner chambers amplifies and focuses sound waves. This could have been used in rituals. A voice in such an environment sounded as if it came from another world, or could be directed inward into a person's own body, inducing an altered state of consciousness. Hidden technologies. Of course, mainstream science is skeptical of such theories. But there are facts that remain unexplained. For example, the Great Pyramid has so-called ventilation shafts. They go upward at a sharp angle, reaching the surface. But there's no body in the pyramid, yet the shafts are still there. What is this? Why such complex engineering solutions in an empty chamber? Some believe these shafts were used for astronomical observations. They are actually aligned with certain stars. But others are convinced they were part of a system whose purpose we still don't understand. There are theories that a special resonance was created inside the pyramid, or that the stone blocks transmitted energy. Sounds fantastic? Yes. But considering the level of engineering, it's not impossible. Stones that are found nowhere else, and the materials used in the construction of the pyramids, also raise questions. Limestone? Yes. But basalt and granite, especially in such quantities and with such precise finishing, are unusual for that era. Many blocks in the Great Pyramid are polished almost to a mirror-like finish. At the same time, there are no traces of bronze tools on them. But there are marks that resemble the effects of heat or vibration. Modern science cannot say for sure how this was done. Some believe that the priests knew the secrets of working stone without mechanical means. Maybe they used chemistry, maybe sound. But there is no evidence for this yet. The priests, as keepers of secrets, whatever the pyramids really are, the priests knew the answers. They took part in the construction, blessed each stage, and performed rituals after completion. And most importantly, they preserved the knowledge of the true purpose of these monuments. But this knowledge was not passed on openly. It was handed down from priest to apprentice. The secret only orally, and only if the apprentice passed all the trials. Perhaps only scraps of this legacy have reached us. Were there priests among them who understood how energy works or knew the secret mechanisms of the human mind? We may never know for sure. But the pyramids stand in silence. And in that silence, there is a challenge. For the ancient Egyptian, death was not the end, but a transition. But not every transition was successful. The journey to the afterlife was a whole science, and only the priests knew its rules. And not in the form of teachings or philosophy, but as clear step-by-step instructions, from organ removal to spells and secret amulets. This chapter is about how the Egyptians encoded death and how mummification became part of the great priestly secret. Why is mummification a ritual and not just a way to preserve the body? Modern people think mummification is just a way to keep the body from decomposing. From a practical point of view, that's true, but for the priest, it was something completely different. It was a process of preparing the soul for its journey. It was believed that the body was a vessel, and if the vessel was destroyed, the soul would not find peace in it. It wouldn't be able to pass through the Duat, a mysterious afterlife full of traps, demons, and trials. Every organ had its own significance, even the tongue, even the fingernails. And if something was removed incorrectly, all the magic, the entire magic of the ritual, would be ruined. Stage 1. Isolation and protection. The first step was to remove the body from the world of the living. The priests called this the separation of the path. The body was taken to a special room, often in or near a temple. There it would lie in complete solitude, under guard, untouched. Even family members were not allowed to approach. It was believed that after death, the soul was still nearby, and the first 2 or 3 days were the most dangerous. If the soul was confused or frightened, it might not leave the body. That's why the priests would begin to quietly recite the texts of passage. These were instructions not for the living, but for the soul. How to proceed, where not to turn, whom to fear. Stage 2. Organ removal. On the 4th day, the main part began. Through a small incision on the left side, the internal organs were removed. But not all of them. The heart was left in place, because it was believed that in the afterlife judgment, the god Anubis would weigh the heart, comparing it to the feather of Maat, the symbol of truth. If the heart was heavier, the soul would perish. If it was lighter, it would move on. The brain, on the other hand, was removed, and it was done through the nostrils. The priests used hooks to carefully extract the brain in pieces. Why? Perhaps they considered it unnecessary. Or maybe they understood that it was in the brain where memories and attachments resided, which could prevent the soul from moving on. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were placed in special vessels called canopic jars, each guarded by a god with an animal head. These were not just ordinary jars. They were a protected archive. The organs were treated with natron, a natural salt that drew out moisture and then sealed tightly. Stage 3. Drying the body. The body was covered with natron for 40 days. It was believed that this period was a time of spiritual purification. The number 40 was not chosen by accident. It appears in the rituals of many ancient cultures as a period of transformation. During these days, the body would dry out completely. Everything was removed except for the skin, bones, and muscles. Sometimes, priests would fill the cavities with linen cloths, sawdust, or even incense to give the body shape and a pleasant scent. The body wasn't just left alone, it was guarded. Texts were read over it, sometimes whispered, sometimes spoken aloud. It was believed that the soul could hear everything. Stage 4. Wrapping and encoding. After drying, the body was wrapped, not just randomly, but according to a specific pattern. First the toes, then the legs, then the arms, then the head, and finally the whole body. Each layer was accompanied by a specific incantation. Each knot was tied with a particular formula. Amulets were placed inside the wrappings. Scarabs, eyes of Horus, ankhs, and figurines of gods. These amulets weren't just for decoration, they activated protection. Some were responsible for vision in the afterlife, others for strength, and still others for memory. Special attention was given to the heart amulet. It was placed on the chest or near the heart. Without it, the soul was considered vulnerable. Step 5. The final ritual, the opening of the mouth. One of the most mystical stages of mummification was the ceremony that priests called the opening of the mouth. This wasn't just a poetic image. It was a literal physical and magical operation. The priest would touch the mummy's lips with a special tool that looked like a small curved knife, made of copper or obsidian. He would touch the ears, eyes, nose, and mouth. It was believed that this act awakened the senses for the afterlife. But there was a deeper meaning behind the ritual, to give the deceased the ability to speak before the gods, to hear the judgment, to see the path, to breathe in eternity. Only a priest who had access to knowledge of the afterlife could perform the ceremony. It was a kind of initiation, and he was not allowed to make a mistake. The secret chambers of the embalmers. The mummification process was never carried out in public. Even today, there are no exact records left. The priests did not keep detailed descriptions. Not because they didn't want to, but because writing it down was forbidden. Everything was passed down orally from teacher to student. The rooms where the ritual was performed were carefully hidden from outsiders. These were usually dark halls next to temples or in special pavilions by the Nile, and sometimes out in the desert, far from prying eyes. That's where the priest embalmers worked. These people rarely appeared in society. They were avoided. Why? Because they touched the dead every day. And in the eyes of the ancient Egyptians, that meant they lived between worlds. People feared them, but also respected them. Some embalmers, after finishing their careers, would withdraw into complete solitude, into temples, where they remained silent for the rest of their lives. They had seen too much. A mistake meant death not only of the body, but also of the soul. To make a mistake during the mummification process meant not just harming the body. A mistake was considered a crime. A priest could be stripped of his rank, exiled, or even killed because the soul perished along with the body. And that was an unforgivable violation of the cosmic order. It was believed that if the soul did not pass into the afterlife, it would become a wandering spirit and could return to the world of the living, bringing disease, drought, and death. To prevent this, the priests performed a final ritual. It was called the path inspection. They recited texts, checked the placement of amulets, and inspected the tightness of the bandages. And only after that was the tomb sealed. The journey to do it and what the priests did with it. According to beliefs, after death the soul entered Duat, a complex system of worlds resembling a labyrinth. There, it faced monsters, judgment, traps, and deception. To make it through this journey, the deceased had to know the names of all enemies, the correct spells, and the order of the chambers. This knowledge was inscribed on the walls of tombs or placed inside as scrolls, pyramid texts, the Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns. But ordinary people did not have access to them. Only select pharaohs, priests, and later wealthy individuals could obtain such instructions. They were written by specially trained scribes in the temple under the supervision of high priests. There were cases when forging such texts resulted in an immediate sentence, because an incorrect name or a wrong formula could lead to the eternal destruction of the soul. The priests were afraid of what they were creating. There are numerous records where priests mention their fear of returning souls who were not given peace, or of those who awakened too early. Some texts prescribe the use of specific amulets to prevent the mummy from rising. Yes, literally. Even in ancient times, priests did not rule out the possibility that something could go wrong. They placed traps, snares, and curses in tombs to protect themselves not only from robbers, but also from the dead themselves. The fear of disrupting the balance between worlds was so strong that even centuries after the pharaoh's death, priests would return to check the tomb, restore its protections, and rewrite the texts. When the last stone slab was lowered onto the tomb and the temple gates closed, everything was only just beginning. For the Egyptian priests, death did not mean the end. It meant protection of the soul, the body, the name, and, most importantly, the secrets. It was believed that if someone disturbed the peace of the dead, especially a pharaoh or an initiated priest, they would be cursed. But were these curses just myths? Or were they carefully planned psychological and physical weapons? The curse of the pharaoh's legend or protection. The story of the pharaoh's curse became famous after the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Almost all members of the expedition died strange and sudden deaths. The media spread rumors about an ancient spell supposedly inscribed above the entrance. Death will come to those who disturb the pharaoh's peace. Scientists explain this with mold, bacteria, or coincidence. But what if the priests really were counting on fear? After all, fear is the most powerful weapon. It can stop a thief, change behavior, even drive someone insane. The priests knew this, and they used that knowledge. Texts of fear. On the walls of some tombs, you can find inscriptions full of threats. May your bones turn to dust if you enter. May a snake bite your heart. May your name be silenced for all eternity. For an Egyptian, the last phrase was the most terrifying, because if a name is forgotten, the soul disappears forever, not just dies, but ceases to exist. The priests skillfully used language to put pressure on anyone who dared to cross the boundaries. These texts were not myths, they were psychological protection. There were also physical traps in the tombs. But there were also more tangible measures. Some tombs contained real traps, hidden shafts leading nowhere, movable stone blocks, corridors that fill with sand. Their purpose was to confuse, injure, or even kill a thief. For example, in some pyramids, stones with hidden mechanisms were installed that would trigger when someone stepped on a certain slab. One wrong step, and the ceiling starts to collapse or the entrance is sealed by a massive boulder. Priests worked together with architects to turn the tomb into a labyrinth of death. And often, the traps weren't obvious but rather hinted at, shrouded in mystery, as if saying, if you are unworthy, you won't leave here alive. The cult of fear as a tool of power. But why all these traps, texts, and curses? The answer is simple. Fear is a means of control. The priests understood that death is a universal fear for all people, and they turned that fear into a barrier between the ordinary and the sacred. The more terrifying death was, the more sacred its control became. The temple, the mummy, and the tomb became not just objects of religion, but tools of control and manipulation. And not just over ordinary people, but over the nobility as well. After all, if you know what awaits you after death and that only a priest can help you with it, you become dependent. That was the hidden power, the protection of the name. Why did they preserve inscriptions? A name in Egypt was not just a signature, it was an extension of the soul. Without a name, a person would disappear. That's why names were carved on walls, sarcophagi, statues, and amulets. The priests made sure that names did not vanish, because if someone erased a name, they destroyed the soul. There were cases when pharaohs ordered the names of their predecessors to be erased, to wipe them from history. This was considered the ultimate form of punishment, and it was usually the priests who acted as defenders of the name, even if that name belonged to a tyrant or a fallen ruler. Secrets of the sarcophagi. A sarcophagus is not just a coffin. It is a capsule that protects the body and the soul. It was made from durable stone, decorated with symbols, and surrounded by spells. And every symbol, every inscription, it's not just decoration, it's a key. Some sarcophagi have several layers, one inside another, sometimes up to 4. Why? For protection, for isolation, and possibly for containment. Some scholars believe that certain sarcophagi may have been deliberately sealed with a ritual to prevent the soul from escaping. Not to let it go, but specifically to keep it contained. What? There is no answer. There were those whom even priests feared after death. Discoveries of sarcophagi without lids and inside, not a body, but ashes, traces of fire, signs of panic. Perhaps at some point something went wrong. Maybe the spirit that was supposed to leave didn't leave. The tombs of the priests, where did their bodies go? One of the strangest mysteries. Why are there so few tombs of the priests themselves? We find the tombs of pharaohs, military leaders, scribes, even artists. But there are almost no tombs of the high priests, the ones who managed the temples, performed rituals, and possessed secret knowledge. Some theories suggest that their bodies were buried unofficially, in hidden places, possibly even inside the temples themselves. Some believe that the priests themselves chose not to leave any traces behind, considering it the final level of initiation, a complete disappearance. But there is also a darker theory that the bodies of the high priests were never buried at all. They might have been destroyed, dissolved, or scattered so that no one could ever use their remains in rituals. Yes, in Egypt there was a belief that parts of the body could serve as gateways to another world. And if the body belonged to a bearer of sacred knowledge, that was especially dangerous. Secret codes and sealed chambers. In many tombs, researchers find strange symbols inscribed in tiny, hidden places, sometimes upside down, sometimes not matching any known writing system. What are they? Some are convinced these are priestly codes, symbols understood only by the initiated. They might also be markers showing where to look for hidden rooms or warnings. There's a theory that inside some pyramids or temples, there are still sealed chambers that even modern Egyptologists don't know about. Why haven't they been opened? Because accessing them would require destroying the structure. And that's exactly what the priests were counting on. If you can't enter without destroying it, then you're not worthy to enter. Why have some mummies disappeared? Over the past 100 years, archaeologists have discovered hundreds of tombs without mummies. Everything is there, the sarcophagus, amulets, inscriptions, but the body is gone, vanished. Were they stolen? Or did the priests do something else? There's a theory that some bodies were never placed inside at all. These were symbolic burials, ritualistic, created for outsiders to see, while the Real ceremony was held secretly somewhere else. Or the bodies were destroyed for special reasons. For example, if a priest broke his oath, or if he possessed knowledge that couldn't be taken with him. The last guardian, silence. The most powerful weapon of a priest is silence, restraint, secrecy, the lack of direct answers. Priests did not seek fame. Their names are rarely mentioned in chronicles. They didn't write autobiographies, but they were the shadow behind the pharaoh, the brain of the temple, guardians of the passage between life and death. A priest's power lies not in what he says, but in what he doesn't say, doesn't show, doesn't reveal. And in this silence lies the main protection of the knowledge encrypted in pyramids, tombs, and rituals, as if they knew that centuries would pass and someone would try to unravel their secrets. But not everyone needs to know the answers. On the throne sat the pharaoh in a golden crown, surrounded by guards and courtiers. He was considered a god on earth. But was he really the most powerful person in Egypt? History says, not always. Often, the real ruler stood in the shadows, without a crown, without an army, but with a much more dangerous weapon, knowledge. We try to keep up with the times by using our services. It was he who decided who would rule, when to start a war, and what should be considered the truth. A temple is not a church, it is a state. To understand the real power of the priest, you need to realize that an Egyptian temple is not just a place for prayers. It is an autonomous structure with its own land, army, taxes, and archives. The largest temples, such as Karnak, own thousands of hectares and tens of thousands of slaves and servants. They had warehouses, ships, herds of cattle, and even their own scribes who copied laws, not just prayers. The priests of the Temple of Ammonius, for example, controlled a huge part of the entire economy of Upper Egypt. Their influence was so great that pharaohs were often afraid of them and tried not to get into conflict. Who is the high priest? He's not just a clergyman. He's a person endowed with an almost divine function as an intermediary between the gods and people. But in practice, he was more like a prime minister or a regent. He took part in making decisions about construction, food distribution, tax control, and even in diplomatic negotiations. His word was law, especially if the pharaoh was young, ill, or politically weak. In some cases, the high priests actually ruled Egypt, maintaining the appearance of the pharaoh's authority but making key decisions on his behalf. For example, the 21st dynasty, the era of the priestly monarchy. After the collapse of centralized power in Egypt, a period began that is known as the Third Intermediate Period. During this time, the capital of Lower Egypt remained Pyramus, where a nominal pharaoh ruled. But in Thebes, in Upper Egypt, the priests seized real power. The high priests of Ammonius became the de facto rulers. They minted their own coins, conducted their own diplomacy, and even decided who would become pharaoh. Some of them passed down power by inheritance, which directly contradicted priestly principles. The priests turned into a dynasty, but not on the throne, instead within the temples. The economy was in the hands of the temple. Gold, grain, and labor all flowed into the temples. People brought offerings, left gifts, and made donations in exchange for the gods' blessings. These riches weren't just stored away. The priests put them to use. They hired workers, built new temples, and strengthened cities. They had their own trade agents who traveled to Nubia, Lebanon, and Mesopotamia. Trade in incense, copper, and wood was conducted through priestly channels. In this way, the temple was at once a bank, a marketplace, a warehouse, and a lawmaker. Controlled through ideology, the pharaoh ruled by divine will. And who interpreted this will? The priests. If the pharaoh went against the temples, he was accused of violating Ma'at, the cosmic order. Such a verdict was worse than rebellion. It meant that the ruler had turned away from the gods. He could be overthrown without war through ideological pressure. The priests could declare any natural disaster, drought, flood, or plague, a result of the pharaoh's sins. The people believed it and began to demand a change in leadership. Initiation and control over the pharaoh. The priests took part in the coronation of every new pharaoh. It was a ritual, but behind the ritual was control. The pharaoh was given the symbols of power, the scepter, the whip, and the crown. But only the priest had the right to declare that he was pleasing to the gods. Without this, the pharaoh was considered illegitimate, meaning vulnerable. Some priests used this dependence to impose their own will. We will give you power, but you have to listen to us. And if you don't listen, we'll find someone else. The secret life of the priests. The priests seemed detached from worldly matters, but that was just an image. In reality, their lives were full of intrigue, power, deals, and sometimes even envy. The high priests lived in temples, but not in poverty. They had villas, servants, stores of gold, precious fabrics, rare perfumes, and tools made from the finest metals. Their children received an education, sometimes even more thorough than that of princes. And some children inherited their father's positions. Entire priestly dynasties formed within the temples. Their influence in society often surpassed that of the nobility. If a priest entered a commoner's house, people would bow to him. If a priest entered an official's house, people would listen to him. If a priest entered the palace, he was feared. Intrigue and rivalry. There was a strict hierarchy within the temples. But where there is hierarchy, there is also competition for position. Some documents from the New Kingdom era contain hints of conspiracies among priests, forgery of religious texts, and power struggles within temple circles. Those who tried to change the order of succession for priestly positions against centuries-old rules were considered especially dangerous. Sometimes the rivalry escalated into actual palace coups. A single priest could inspire a royal advisor to go against the pharaoh, or, on the contrary, persuade the ruler himself to eliminate those he disliked. Priests did not act with the sword. They acted with words, hints, and fear. They ruled through the minds of others. Why did pharaohs start to fear the temples? At first, the temples served the pharaoh, but later, the temples began to serve themselves. The power of the temples became so great that even the pharaoh himself had to ask for permission to take certain actions. For example, to be buried in a specific place or to use temple resources for building palaces. The pharaohs tried to fight against this. One of the most striking examples is Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaten. He tried to destroy the cult of Ammonius and introduce a new cult of Aten. Why? Because the cult of Ammonius was completely controlled by the priests who interfered with his rule. He moved the capital, closed the temples, and exiled the high priests. But after his death, the temple of Ammonius returned with renewed strength. And the next pharaoh was named Tutankhamun, the living embodiment of Ammonius. That was a symbol. The priests won again. The priests as guardians of legitimacy. The pharaoh's power was based not only on the army and gold, it was based on an idea. And that idea was controlled by the priests. Only they could declare that the pharaoh, the son of Ra, chosen by the gods, was the embodiment of Ma'at. If the priests refused to grant this formula, the pharaoh lost his sanctity. He might not be recognized. He could be denied an honorable burial, and that meant losing eternal life. That's why pharaohs tried to stay on good terms with the temples, made donations, built new sanctuaries, and erected obelisks. These weren't just acts of piety. They were payments for support, espionage, and control. Some pharaohs realized that the power of the temples was too dangerous. They started sending spies into the temples, disguised as servants, scribes, and even students, to keep an eye on the priests' internal politics. There is evidence that, in response, the priests set up secret schools where they taught only their own, with no outsiders allowed. These schools didn't just teach religion, they also passed on knowledge of medicine, architecture, mathematics, and alchemy. This knowledge was strictly controlled. The priests understood, whoever has knowledge rules. More than 3,000 years have passed. Empires have risen and fallen. Computers, satellites, and microscopes have appeared. We have decoded DNA, traveled into space. Yet the priests of ancient Egypt still remain a mystery. Why? Because they didn't leave us any direct answers. Their legacy isn't a book with a table of contents. It's a labyrinth, a cipher, a deliberate system where every piece of knowledge is not a gift, but a test. Only those who search deeply can find. Where did their knowledge go? Many ancient cultures left behind textbooks, treatises, philosophical schools. Egypt, no. Where there could have been a library, there is silence. Where there could have been an encyclopedia, there is a drawing, a hint, a symbol. Why? Because the priests believed that knowledge should only be passed on to the chosen few. They believed that the revelation of truth could destroy the mind of someone unprepared. Knowledge was like fire. It could warm, but it could also burn. That's why everything was preserved in memory, rituals, architecture, geometry, and sound. Their science was a language of forms and energies. Can't just be read, it has to be experienced. What was deliberately destroyed? With the arrival of Greco-Roman rule in Egypt, many things changed. Temples began to lose their influence and many texts were destroyed, especially those dealing with forbidden subjects. The structure of the soul, rituals, initiations, and practices of immortality. When the Christians arrived, temple cults were declared pagan. Priests were persecuted, papyri were burned, and some texts were simply rewritten, but in a different form with their meaning changed. Some things went underground, some into the desert, and some disappeared forever. There is an opinion that the Library of Alexandria stored texts written by priests, and its destruction was not an accident. but a targeted blow against ancient knowledge. What do we really know? We have deciphered the hieroglyphs. We have discovered dozens of tombs. We have studied mummification methods. But to be honest, we only know the surface. What do the mysterious symbols in inaccessible chambers mean? Why do the pyramids resonate with sound? What is the meaning of the illogical rooms and niches? Why were some tombs found empty? Much of what we see we can't interpret because we don't have the key. And the key was with the priests, and it wasn't physical. It was inside a system of thinking that was destroyed. Why do these mysteries still frighten us? Even now, archaeologists are afraid to touch certain areas. Not because they're superstitious, but because they don't understand what they're dealing with. Some chambers remain sealed to this day. Some research has been put on hold. The psychological fear hasn't gone away either. Newspapers still write about curses. Tourists in Egypt still feel the energy inside the tombs. Scientists argue whether this is just self-suggestion or a remnant of ancient engineering of emotions. The priests knew how to control perception. And if it still works after 30 centuries, isn't that proof of its power? The stones speak, but not to everyone. When you look at a pyramid, you see stone. The weight, the shape, the architecture, all of it seems understandable. But the ancient Egyptians used to say, things have souls. And the priests believed that the pyramid was not just a structure, but living knowledge. But not for everyone, only for those who are ready to receive it. They left us not words, but a system of silence. Everything they created is a mystery that cannot be solved by intellect, can only be felt. To enter the darkness of the pyramid, to hear the emptiness, to feel the cold of the stone, and then perhaps you will come closer to understanding. The priests were like masters of the invisible. In our time, knowledge is numbers, diagrams, graphs. For the priests, everything was different. They studied the rhythms of life, the influence of sound, the symbols of dreams, the transitions between states. They believed that a person's inner world is a map. And if you know how to navigate it, you can control not only yourself, but others as well. The priests were not just scholars. They were directors of perception, creating spaces where feelings were heightened, where consciousness shifted from logic to intuition. Their rituals were a kind of psychotechnology. Their texts were a code. Their silence was a filter for the unprepared. But what if the answers are already close by? Every year, technology reveals something new to us. We scan pyramids, peer through layers beneath temples, and use neural networks to analyze texts. But maybe the most important discovery has already been made. Maybe we just don't understand its significance. What if the empty chamber isn't empty at all, but is actually a perfectly tuned space for meditation? What if the sound echoing in the galleries is actually an activator of an ancient ritual? What if the sarcophagus isn't a tomb, but a capsule for the rebirth of consciousness? We look for answers on the outside, but the priests always taught, look within. Why did they disappear without a trace? One of the main mysteries, why did such a powerful class vanish without a trace? Where are their descendants? Where are their schools? Where are those who carried on their legacy? Maybe it's because that's what they wanted. The last priests probably destroyed their own texts, hid their knowledge, and dissolved into history themselves, as if they realized humanity just isn't ready yet. Maybe they didn't leave at all. Maybe they left their knowledge within the culture itself, in fairy tales, in symbols, in architecture. Maybe they just changed their form because the real secret isn't what is hidden, but what hides in plain sight. One last thought. We can keep digging up the earth, opening tombs, and scanning walls. But until we understand the mindset of the priests, we won't get any closer to their truth. They saw the world differently, not as a collection of facts, but as a system of connections. For them, everything was connected. Sand and star, body and shadow, word and silence. And maybe that's exactly why their secrets are still alive today. Because they weren't science, they were the art of living between worlds. If you enjoyed this journey into the darkness and light of ancient Egypt, subscribe to our channel and give us a like. There are even more fascinating and intriguing stories ahead. Stories that will truly make you see the past in a completely new and unexpected way. See you in a dream, in a temple, or perhaps somewhere else entirely, in a place you never imagined,